Every schoolchild in the United States is taught the same story about the Statue of Liberty. It was a gift from France, conceived as a gesture of Republican solidarity between two nations that shared a commitment to democratic ideals. It was designed by a sculptor named Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, engineered by the man who would later build the Eiffel Tower, and assembled on a small island in New York Harbor on a pedestal funded by American public donations. The torch represents enlightenment. The broken chain at her feet represents freedom from tyranny. The 7 rays of the crown represent the 7 seas and 7 continents. The story is complete. It is consistent. It has a beginning, a middle, and a meaning that fits without remainder into the narrative of American exceptionalism and Franco-American friendship. It is also a story that, when you stand back far enough to see the full picture, sits on top of something that the story does not explain and has never been asked to explain. Because before the statue was there, and before the pedestal was built, and before the fundraising campaigns and the newspaper editorials and the dedication ceremony of 1886, there was a structure on Bedloe's Island that had been there for a very long time. And that structure is not a footnote to the statue's history. It is, for the Tartaria researcher, the entire point. The structure is called Fort Wood. It was designated a military fortification in the early 19th century and is described in the official history as a star fort, a defensive military installation built in the style common to American coastal fortifications of the period. This description is accurate as far as it goes. Fort Wood is indeed a star fort. It has 11 points. It is built of granite. Its walls still stand as the base on which the statue's pedestal was erected, meaning the statue does not simply stand on an island. It stands on the raised platform of an 11-pointed star fort whose origin the official history attributes to the early American Republic and whose purpose the official history describes as coastal defense. Both of those attributions deserve more scrutiny than they have received, because the Tartaria investigation has been examining star forts for years now, and the picture that examination produces is not the picture the official history of American military engineering presents. Before we go further, if you have been watching the star fort evidence accumulate across the Tartaria investigation, and you are ready to apply it to the most visible monument in the Western world, subscribe now, because this is the script where the pieces connect. Star forts, as the Tartaria investigation understands them, are one of the most consistent signatures of the pre-reset world in the built environment of the modern one. They appear on every inhabited continent. They appear in locations that the official military history struggles to explain as purely defensive sites. They appear built to standards of engineering precision that the eras to which they are attributed were not reliably capable of producing. And they appear, with a regularity the investigation considers far beyond coincidence, at locations that correspond to nodes in what the investigation has come to call the grid, the network of energetically significant sites that the pre-reset civilization used for purposes that the post-reset world converted to military, religious, or administrative use, because conversion was more efficient than demolition, and because the structures were too well built to demolish easily. Fort Wood on Bedloe's Island is one of those structures. And the Statue of Liberty is not a monument placed in New York Harbor for reasons of symbolic geography. It is a monument placed on a pre-existing node site at a moment when the new civilization needed to claim the node for its own symbolism, because the alternative was to leave the node unmarked, and unmarked nodes draw questions. To understand what makes Fort Wood unusual as a fortification, you have to look at what it was supposedly built to defend and against whom. A star fort is a specific military technology developed in Europe in response to cannon fire, whose geometry eliminates the blind spots that straight-walled fortifications create. The angled points mean any approaching enemy is exposed to fire from at least 2 directions, regardless of their angle of approach. It is an effective defensive design, but its effectiveness depends entirely on an enemy that approaches from outside the fort's perimeter, on land. As a harbour defence, a star fort on a small island makes no sense, because a harbour attack comes from the water. The angles of Fort Wood's 11 points are not oriented to provide overlapping fire against vessels approaching through the harbour. They are oriented in a geometry that has no coherent military explanation relative to the actual threats New York Harbour faced in the period when the fort was supposedly built. The official military historians note this awkwardness and resolve it by describing Fort Wood as a supplementary position. But supplementary positions are not built in granite. They are not built with the precision of line and angle that Fort Wood displays. Supplementary positions are built quickly and practically. Fort Wood was built to last. The 11 points are the detail the Tartaria researcher examines most carefully, because the number 11 is not a standard number of points for a star fort in the American military tradition. The standard configurations are 5, 6, or 8 points, corresponding to the geometries that provide optimal overlapping fields of fire for a conventional defensive position. 11 points is an unusual choice for any purely military application, and it is an unusually specific choice, because 11 is a number with a particular significance in the esoteric tradition that the Tartaria investigation has found woven through the construction of pre-reset nodes worldwide. The investigation does not claim that every 11-pointed structure in history was built by the same civilization for the same purpose. It claims that the 11-pointed geometry at specific node locations, including locations with the energetic and geographical characteristics of Bedloes Island, is not accidental and is not primarily military. It is a design signature. And Fort Wood displays it with the same precision and the same orientation that the investigation has documented at other node sites in Europe, in North Africa, and in the American interior. The island itself is part of the argument. Bedloes Island, before it was renamed Liberty Island in 1956, sits at a specific position in New York Harbour that the Tartaria investigation has mapped against the broader node grid of the northeastern American coast. The position is not optimal for harbour defence, as military engineers acknowledged when they described the fort as supplementary, but it is optimal for something else. The island sits at the intersection of two water-based energy lines. The investigation has traced through the harbour's geography the kind of geological and hydrological features the investigation has found associated with node locations globally. The star fort sits exactly on the intersection point. The statue sits on the star fort, and Bartholdi selected the island according to the official history for its dramatic visual position and its visibility from arriving ships. That is a valid aesthetic reason. It is also exactly the kind of surface reason offered for a site selection with a deeper logic the official history is not prepared to discuss. The official account of Fort Wood's construction places it in the period between 1807 and 1811, in the years of American defensive build-up preceding the War of 1812. This is the dating that appears in the National Park Service's documentation of the site. But the investigation has examined this dating against the physical evidence of the structure itself and found a mismatch of the kind the investigation has encountered at other officially dated fortifications that it regards as pre-reset in origin. The mismatch is in the masonry. The granite construction of Fort Wood's walls displays a jointing technique and a precision of fit that the American military construction of the early 19th century did not consistently produce in its documented works. Comparison between Fort Wood's masonry and the documented masonry of fortifications built by American military engineers in the same period shows a quality differential that is not attributable to the use of better materials or a larger workforce. It is attributable to a different standard of construction, a standard that the investigation associates with the pre-reset building tradition, rather than the post-reset military engineering tradition that the official dating assigns it to. The dating problem at Fort Wood is not unique. The Tartaria investigation has documented the same mismatch at a series of American fortifications that appear on the official record as early national period constructions, but that display physical characteristics more consistent with structures that predate European settlement. These arguments do not appear in mainstream historical literature because the mainstream lacks a framework for the pre-reset building tradition and treats the mismatches as anomalies within the official story rather than evidence of a different story entirely. But the mismatches are consistent, and a pattern of consistent anomalies all pointing in the same direction is not a random distribution of errors. It is the shape of a suppressed truth showing through in the places where the suppression was not quite complete. Bartholdi's selection of the sites is worth examining through the Tartaria lens, because Bartholdi was not simply a sculptor making a practical decision about harbour visibility. Bartholdi was a Freemason, and the Masonic tradition in the 19th century maintained a specific relationship to the pre-reset node sites the Tartaria investigation has documented across Europe and the American continent. The Masonic understanding of sacred geometry, of the significance of specific numerical configurations, of the energetic properties of specific locations, is a degraded inheritance from the pre-reset building tradition. But it is an inheritance. Masons did not build Fort Wood. But Masons knew what Fort Wood was, the way an heir knows the value of an object in a collection, even after losing knowledge of how it was made. When Bartholdi selected Bedloe's Island and its existing star fort as the base for his monument, he was making a choice the Masonic framework would have recognized as appropriate for a structure intended to mark a significant node. He was not inventing a symbolic location. He was completing one. The torch is the most direct signal in the Tartaria reading of the monument. A woman holding a torch aloft at the entrance to the most important harbour in the most powerful nation of the modern world is not primarily a symbol of enlightenment in the abstract philosophical sense. In the pre-reset symbolic vocabulary, which survives in fragmentary form through the Masonic tradition and through the iconographic programs of the demolished buildings, the Tartaria investigation has studied across American cities. A torch held at a significant node marks a site of energetic relevance. It marks a node the way a lighthouse marks a navigational hazard, not for ships, but for the tradition of those who knew the grid and used it. The statue's torch is not a symbol of freedom offered to the tired and poor arriving by sea. It is a marker. It says, to anyone with the framework to read it, that the site below is a site the tradition knows, significant before the harbour was a harbour and before the nation was a nation. The broken chain at the statue's feet is another element the official symbolism explains as representing freedom from tyranny. This is not a false reading. Symbols hold multiple meanings, and the official reading of the chain is real. But in the pre-reset symbolic vocabulary, chains also represent the binding of a node, the sealing of an energy connection that the pre-reset civilization used and the post-reset civilization either cannot use or has chosen not to acknowledge. A broken chain at the base of a monument standing on a node is a statement about that node's status in the new order. The torch marks it open to symbolic view, the chain marks it closed to actual use. The statue itself is the cover, the most complete and most public conversion of a pre-reset node into a post-reset monument that the Tartaria investigation has yet documented. None of this is provable to the standard that the official history requires for the modification of its record. The Fort Wood masonry comparison is an argument from physical evidence that has not been subjected to the kind of professional archaeological analysis that would either confirm or refute it. The node grid mapping is an investigative framework that is not recognized by mainstream geography or geology. The Masonic connection to pre-reset knowledge is an argument about the transmission of fragmented understanding that mainstream history treats as either speculative or eccentric. What the Tartaria investigation asks is not that you accept any of these arguments as established fact. It asks that you notice the accumulation, a structure of unusual geometric configuration, sited at a location with no coherent military explanation, built to a standard that exceeds the documented capability of its official era, selected by a man whose tradition maintained a specific relationship to the pre-reset building program, crowned with a symbol that the pre-reset vocabulary uses to mark node sites, standing on a broken chain that the same vocabulary uses to mark a closed portal, and presented to the world as a symbol of freedom so complete and so celebrated that the question of what the structure beneath the symbol actually is has never in 140 years of public prominence been seriously asked. The most visible monument in the Western world is standing on something it has never been asked to explain. The 11 points are still there. Under the pedestal, under the statue, under the story. They have been there longer than the story. And they will be there after the story is finally examined with the kind of attention it has always deserved. Stay with this channel, the grid has more nodes, and not all of them have statues on top.